President, did you use that?
No.
We won't waste it then. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak on this bill, the Homes Tasmania bill, and there are certainly many things to be said. A great deal of words, in fact, have already been spoken about this bill by the government in the media, in correspondence to us, in ministerial statements, in the other place, here in the second reading speech yesterday, and yet all those words have delivered a remarkable lack of clarity, I think. Very little specific detail and much obfuscation. Word salad is how I'd charitably describe a lot of it. And because we've been served a salad instead of a genuine, specific and rational argument for the model presented in the bill, it has been quite a task for us to assess it, which is a shame. Good, transparent policy process, rationally made argument with clear, specific detail is helpful when you bring something to this place and ask us to assess it and support it. So I'd like to provide my take on this. I'll try to be as clear and rational as possible on the bill that we have before us. And to begin, Mr. President, I think that we can probably establish a few things that we are all likely to agree on. And I know the Minister's been keen to point to things that we could agree on. And the first one that I would point out is that we know things are bad in Tasmania in relation to housing affordability and housing insecurity. We have all heard the stats. We know that there's 4,000 plus 4,500 odd households waiting for social housing. It's up just from a year ago. We know that. The time for priority applicants to be housed is at a shocking level, close to 90 weeks. Unbelievable. We know that 1 in 82 Tasmanians receive homelessness services. That's a figure that's higher than the national average, quite a bit higher. We know that 46 people a day are turned away from specialist homelessness services in Tasmania. That doesn't sound like much when you say 46 a day, in a way, but it's 16,800 odd, just shy of that, turnaways in a year. That's a lot of turnaways in this small state. The number of households in Tasmania that are renting is increasing. It's up 11% in the census data from 2016 to 2021. A higher proportion of us are renting in that way. It's now close to 58,000 households in this state who are renters, and we know that the rental market has catastrophically failed. Private rental market. Private rental vacancy rates, catastrophically low. That's the only word I can use to describe it. It's well under 1% in Hobart. 0.6% I think was the latest figure. Burnie, I think, has a shocking figure of 0.2%. Beyond market failure, far beyond. A big driver of homelessness that we are currently seeing is people experiencing rent hikes and then not being able to afford those rent hikes because they're in the vicinity of 10, 20% more at a time on their rent. And that's because the only constraint we put on rent increases in this state, we're very backward in this respect, the only constraint we put is market equivalence, which basically equals a race to the top when it comes to what you can charge for rent and how quickly you can keep increasing it. More people renting, catastrophic failure in the rental market, driving homelessness, on top of the other things that are driving homelessness in this state. Over the term of this Liberal government, across the 8 years, things have become much, much, much worse. Not all of those things are this government's responsibility, absolutely not. There's a broader context around this. There are federal issues around this and federal levers around this too, but this is the government at a state level that has had the responsibility for managing it for us, and it is much, much worse. So it's well established. We know things are bad. We can all agree on that in relation to housing affordability and insecurity in relation to homelessness. We've heard that reinforced just yesterday in the briefings we've had from community service providers, Mr. President, who are at the front line of the housing emergency. I hear it in my conversations with people in that sector all the time. Essentially, what they were able to express is they are desperate to have more homes to put people in. Which brings us, I think, to the second thing that we could all agree on. We know we want to build more public and social housing as quickly as possible in this state. After 8 years of virtual standstill, really, on public and social housing, the government has made ambitious commitments to build a building program over the next decade to build 10,000 homes, to deliver 10,000 homes through building or acquiring. So we're not necessarily talking about 10,000 additional to our housing stock totally, but building or acquiring 10,000 public and social housing homes. The federal government too, pleasingly, has indicated an intention to invest more and provide funding mechanisms for building more public and social housing. Excellent. We absolutely need shared effort across levels of government. We have a keen and capable community housing sector here, with not-for-profit community housing developers and providers already charging ahead with their own building programs. They have been a real success story in this state in recent years in terms of delivering for our state on the social housing side. But we have recognised constraints on building things quickly. And the constraints that are most regularly identified, Mr. President, are, as we are all quite familiar and we can all agree on, workforce limitations, planning system constraints, land availability challenges. These are consistently identified as the barriers to getting more houses built quickly. So to recap, Mr. President, we know things are bad on the housing affordability and insecurity front. We know we need to urgently build more, but there are constraints. The third thing I think we can all probably agree on pretty safely is that we have a sector of housing and homelessness service providers that are committed, capable and keen for innovation. A whole suite of services and programs are provided in this state in the area of housing and homelessness, with a skilled workforce and a demonstrated history of developing innovative, evidence-based new approaches to achieve better outcomes for Tasmanians. Mr. President, we only have to look at examples. Let's go back a bit. Common Ground Initiative, when it was first brought to this state. More recently, we've got youth foyer models being used by Anglicare for supported accommodation for young people from 16 to 25. For a number of years now, we've been developing that side of things. We've got Colony 47 adopting exciting approaches like advantaged thinking approaches to underpin their work. Looking at things like their HASI initiative that they brought in, it's brought in from a model from New South Wales, I believe, which provides integrated housing and mental health supports. The list could go on and on in that sector. They're skilled, they're capable, they're keen to innovate, and they are driving that innovation as best they can within the constraints that they operate in. So, innovation in that sector and development and rolling out better innovation of even more effective services are constrained. They're constrained by a lack of effective government leadership and planning, stalled reforms processes, and crucially a lack of adequate, secure operational funding from the state government in an ongoing way. An example of that, just to provide a small one. Anglicare's operated supported accommodation for young people across this state for many years, and it's based on, as I said, that youth foyer model, an excellent model. I don't believe, I could be wrong and I'm open to being corrected, but I don't believe that those facilities under that model here in this state have ever been provided with a level of funding that allows for the full implementation of the model. So they're not able to be accredited to that excellent model, that internationally recognised excellent model, because the state government has always undersold them, sold them short on operational funding to achieve the full model. Another example, the Housing Connect model. In terms of innovative and effective processes, Housing Connect model is a great one. One front door to a whole suite of services delivered through a partnership of 5 organisations statewide. Excellent initiative at the time. It's stalled though because it's been in a process of review and reform for some time and it hasn't landed anywhere yet, and we're keeping waiting and waiting. That's the sense of stalledness, I think, that the sector is feeling at the moment, and they're desperate for that to change. So to recap, Mr. President, we know things are bad in relation to housing affordability and insecurity. We know we need to urgently build more public and social housing, but there are constraints. And we know we've got a sector of skilled service providers keen to innovate, but also in some senses constrained and stalled. 3 things I think pretty straightforwardly we could probably agree on. Questions that occur to me then are this. Firstly, does the bill and the model in it fix those things? My short answer is largely no. It does not address the factors driving housing unaffordability and skyrocketing rents. We wouldn't expect it to address a whole raft of those factors. They're well beyond it. But it's not going to fix that. It's not a magic wand for it. The key reason it doesn't do that within the scope of what it does cover is that it can't fix those things that are stopping us building things quickly. It can't necessarily fix workforce limitations, planning system constraints. It can look at the area of land availability, but quite frankly, we already have mechanisms that it largely replicates to do that already in terms of identifying and freeing up Crown land and other land, and we have the housing supply order process that's already in place. So we've got a lot of those mechanisms there.
With its problems.
Indeed, with its problems. Not to say we wouldn't want to fix and improve what's there. Yeah. I'll come to that in a minute. It's not a choice between doing nothing or doing this.
No.
And the bill doesn't specifically point to any different way of working with the community services sector in regards to funding, reforms or models of working that isn't available now, that couldn't be done under the situation we have. My next question then, in terms of thinking of those things we could agree on, is this then, this bill and this model that it contains, the best way to fix those things? And I think my short answer to that is I don't know. Don't know, Mr President, if this is the best way to fix some of those things, partly. It hasn't been demonstrated why our current challenges can't be addressed within the framework of the current system, but with changes and improvements made. It's interesting because I did note when I looked back through submissions made on the draft bill, the Housing Choices Tasmania submission, noting that the draft bill, and I'll quote, does not appear to be any significant change to what the state housing jurisdiction is already able to do. Others have made this point too. It's still unclear, really, the extent of what's delivered that's different through this model, except for maybe one key thing which we'll come to. Case has not been made why this change is the best indicated way forward. We've not seen any credible policy development process in which options and solutions were explored and tested against each other. I'll come back to that one too. Another important question that springs to mind in terms of those three things we could agree on is, other than whether it would work and whether it's the best option, what other impacts might this bill have and the model that's in it have that would impact on the state and on the citizens of our state? And my short answer is, I don't think we know clearly enough the answer to that question. There's a lot of unanswered questions in terms of what eventual impact this may have, what secondary impacts it may have, what unintended consequences it may have. As we're all aware, Mr President, it's the unintended consequences, the secondary impacts, the collateral damage sometimes, that are often overlooked and pushed past in a rush to implement a shiny new thing. And I must admit, Mr President, my radar is also up in this instance in relation not so much to the unintended consequences, but whether there may be covertly intended consequences and what they may be. Call me suspicious. I think it's fair to say we need to be thinking about what agendas are being run here. We're talking here about the fundamental basis on which the state government provides public and social housing to support its citizens' right to housing. We're talking about a very large state asset base and how it's managed, developed, disposed of and prioritised. Ideological agendas at play here could be setting us on a course of fundamentally undermining a state government role and public assets. That's something that concerns me, Mr President. I don't feel that has been sufficiently and transparently examined so that we can have confidence in the degree to which there are or aren't ideological agendas at play here, covert intended consequences. So, where does that leave us? Having shared some of that thinking that sits behind my approach here to this bill, Mr President, I'd like to just mention a few of the things in relation to the bill in more detail and how that is also playing on my mind. I can't help but reflect that if you have identified that current practice is not working and there's a need to change, you're faced with two choices. Do you fix the thing you have, or do you create something new? And in this case, clearly it seems the government has chosen in a fundamental way not to fix what we have, but to discard it and create something new. But we haven't seen that decision-making play out as a transparent and evidence-based process. What specifically is the problem or problems that we're trying to solve here? Where has that been consulted on, clearly identified and quantified? Consultation only occurred on this new model after the bill was drafted, well after the decision was made and announced back in March. And Mr President, as I alluded to in the aside to the member for Hobart a moment ago, there was never a binary choice for us here, and we shouldn't be pushed to think that there was. It should never have been a situation where we were somehow made to feel that the choice was between doing nothing and staying exactly as we are, or doing this model in this bill. And yet, from many stakeholders that we talked to, and some we heard from in briefings, there seems to be that sense that they have, and in the light of which they offer optimistic and somewhat puzzled support for this bill, where they're desperate to see improvement. They're desperate to get more housing built as quickly as possible. They know what we have now isn't working. They want change from their stalled situations, and they want to see something happen. So they say, this is something happening. Perhaps it might work. We could give it a try. But I think that that's incredibly disappointing, because I don't think that points to an appropriate process to explore and define and arrive at the best way forward when we're just presented with this way forward. And I think it's interesting to contemplate and ask, because it's certainly not clear, is whose idea was this? How was this option identified as the most appropriate solution to the specific problems that we have? It was announced quite out of the blue. Where did it come from? Who was the decision maker, and when did that decision happen at the outset? Let's remind ourselves about that, Mr President. The announcement of the new Housing Authority. Out of the blue in March this year, in then Premier Gutwin's Premier's address in Parliament, we heard that the Department of Communities Tasmania was to be summarily dismantled. No warning, no consultation, perhaps not even the head of the department knew that it was going to happen till just before it happened. Announced it would be pulled apart this year and shut down. A department that was a mere 6 years old, Mr President, a department that was formed in 2016 by this Liberal government with the stated intention at that time to bring together services with natural alignments to reduce silos. I believe that was a very explicit intention of that department. And then out of the blue in 2022, 6 years later, we're getting rid of it. And the reason given for that, Mr President? Wait for it, to better align services and to reduce silos. Blow me down, Mr President, this just verges on the Orwellian sometimes when we get into this territory. And of course, as part of the scrapping of the Department of Communities, the current Housing Tasmania element of the department, perhaps ironically, was facing homelessness. What to do with Housing Tasmania? The government's answer here, clearly, was package it up as an authority and give it to a skills-based board to run. No consultation, no transparent process, no involvement, to my knowledge, of staff or stakeholders until well after that decision was made. This looks like, to me, Mr President, this looks like a government that has given up on its own ability to develop and implement policy, to manage functional relationships with stakeholders. Not only given up on itself, but also, perhaps most sadly, has lost faith in the public service to develop and implement policy and manage functional relationships with stakeholders. Giving up and handing it over in the assumption that a more perhaps private sector approach will automatically be better. The assumption that giving core state government responsibilities and functions to a small group who are not elected and are not public servants. Maybe the core issue is that this government can't maintain functional relationships with departments and the public service. Maybe that is why it is so ready to dismantle and discard them and instead set up something approximating their functions in a separate entity entirely. I'm hearing echoes here, Mr President, of what we saw last year with the TASTAFE. Makes me wonder what's next, and I think from Member for Elwick's contribution, I'm not the only one. What other core responsibilities of state government will the government deem to be dysfunctional and want to break up with? Which parts of our health system, which parts of our education system could be hived off? It is a concern. It begs the question, I think. The way this has been done, the way it's been decided on and presented, begs the questions. Mr President, I'd like to spend some time now touching on a couple of particular aspects of the bill and some of the rhetoric around it, and just raise a few questions. Knowing that I'll have plenty more in the committee stage, Mr President, so I won't be veering into that territory here, but it goes to my assessment of the bill. The second reading speech says that, I quote, "The authority will be responsible for delivering improved housing services." How? In what ways will housing services be improved under this model by this bill? What will be different? How are the improvements not able to be delivered under the current model? What is it about Homes Tasmania, as iterated in this bill, that makes these improvements possible that wouldn't be possible now? I've heard the Minister assert that the model will deliver improved partnerships and greater collaboration. How specifically? How? Clearly, under the current model, we have partnerships and we have collaboration. There's always room for improvement. Why can't it happen under this model? What's special about the model proposed in this bill that means we can have improvements and extensions that aren't available now? There's one area, perhaps. We'll come to it. Livable communities. The second reading speech also talks about, and I'll quote this bit, "the broader role that the authority will play in ensuring the well-being of those in need of housing and homelessness services, as well as in building livable communities." That's a lot to unpack. Again, in what way specifically will Homes Tasmania have a broader role in ensuring the well-being of those in need of housing and homelessness services than the entity that is within the Department of Communities right now? How will that be different? There's nothing unique about this model that will deliver that couldn't be delivered under the current model, improved and done differently within the current model. In what way specifically, though, thinking about those livable communities, in what way specifically will Homes Tasmania have a broader role in building livable communities than we have and see in the system now? I think that's an interesting one. That seems to imply that there'll be some insertion into the planning system. It seems to imply that there'll be a way to facilitate other aspects of community building, but I don't see that necessarily reflected in the bill. And I beg the question, surely that's what we do now in a collaborative way, or we could potentially be doing in a collaborative way across a range of areas within government who all work and work into the space of building livable communities, and not just state government, but of course different levels of government, particularly local government in that space too. Mr President, another claim made in the second reading speech is that the bill establishes a new framework, the right framework to future-proof housing for many decades to come. It also says we need to be innovative, agile and responsive, and we need to change the way we've been doing things to be more contemporary, to prepare for the next decade and beyond. It's very hard, Mr President, not to feel that these are just buzzwords and catchphrases plucked out of the air. Future-proof, throw that in, sounds great. Sounds great. Agile, gosh. I think government should be banned. Government at all levels should be banned from ever using that word ever again. How ridiculous.
Very cynical.
More contemporary, sounds great. Very impressive to say that we're going to be more contemporary, absolutely. But it's very hard to feel that beyond grabbing a few buzzwords and catchphrases to throw in. There's literally no explanation from the government as to how the new arrangements in this model are able to be more agile, innovative and responsive, nor how they are more contemporary. Deciding to change something with no demonstrated evidence-based, no apparent consultation into the decision-making, only post-decision-making, doesn't make it contemporary. That's not responsive, it's reactive. And again, Mr President, according to the second reading speech, we must change how we have done things in the past to allow more innovation, more efficiency and faster developments to get houses out of the ground and providing homes for people who need them as quickly as possible. Agreed. What have been the main barriers? We've already identified. The main barriers holding up getting houses out of the ground are not related largely to matters in this bill. Community housing providers in their submissions identified a range of areas of reform that they saw as key to speeding up the process for getting houses out of the ground. I think among those, most of them related to planning systems. Some even had some out there suggestions like compulsory acquisition expansion, things like that, which is, gosh, an interesting discussion for another day. But none of the things that were suggested by those community housing providers related to matters in this bill in terms of getting things out of the ground quicker, making houses available more promptly for the Tasmanian people. This bill's not fixing that. I agree, though, with the Minister that we must change how we have done things in the past. Absolutely, to allow for more innovation, yes. Is this the only way we can do it? No. We could have a conversation about better ways to do it, absolutely. It's interesting to have read through some of the materials and to read through the second reading speech and hear it here in the chamber, and to hear about the archaic Homes Act. The government mentions structural difficulties in the operation of the Homes Act and suggests that attempts to modernise old laws over time can overcomplicate and even render unworkable many of their provisions. And that if we were to continue to rely on the Homes Act, apparently there will continue to be many constraints, that was the words, on the provision of more homes for Tasmanians, especially more vulnerable members of the community. Interesting. No examples were provided about that. No clarity on what will be done under the new model that couldn't be done in the existing Act necessarily, except to borrow, of course, we'll come to that. Many aspects of the Homes Act have in fact been carried forward directly into this bill. So of course, as we well know here, pieces of legislation do need to be updated. We do need to make changes. We do need to add or remove things to either bring them up to date or to move with a new approach or new way of working. We've actually done a great deal of that with this bill, with the previous Homes Act, or the current, I should say, Homes Act. It's not previous yet, Mr President. Large parts of this bill are literally the Homes Act brought forward. At times, things have been reformatted and redrafted to probably a more contemporary drafting style, but there's literally swathes of it right here in this bill, that archaic Homes Act. So there's obviously no problem updating the archaic Homes Act. We could have done it. It didn't mean we had to put a new model in, but there you go. So, yes, just to recap on that, an out-of-date Act in need of review and updating does not justify a fundamental change of model. You can't equate those two things. You can't equate a need to update an Act with a switch to an entirely new model. The complete removal of the central responsibility of state government from the public service of providing housing, public and social housing, and to vest it into an untested and unproven separate entity is not the only outcome from deciding we have to update an Act. Mr President, the second reading speech says also in this bill, says that this bill will ensure Tasmania has the most integrated whole-of-system approach to developing land, building, procuring, maintaining, modifying and disposing of homes that may have passed their use-by date. And again, it's just more questions around that, because they're just words on a page if we haven't actually had a demonstration of how is it more integrated. We had Housing Tasmania sitting within the Department of Communities. Tasmania doesn't get much more integrated than that, with a whole range of services that sit around it. We have government being responsible for the housing services. We also have government in other areas responsible for planning, responsible for infrastructure. We've got that sitting within the state government. We should be able to think of our state government as being integrated. I know the reality is that often it's not, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be more integrated by plucking a piece out and giving responsibility to an unelected non-public service board. I can't help but feel, Mr. President, that in relation to this Act, we've seen a lot of nonsensical, opaque rhetoric. Virtually no clear explanation or rationale provided, multitudes of questions with no clear answers given, and a distinct sense that an agenda, for me at least, a distinct sense that an agenda may well be being pursued. And that agenda, my radar is most acute in terms of any agenda around public and social housing. Public and social housing are not mentioned in the bill. They're not descriptors that we use in legislation. But it does prompt us to ask, where are they in all this? Public housing is not even mentioned in the second reading speech. The second reading speech mentions increasing the supply of social and affordable housing in the first paragraph. Thereafter only refers to affordable housing. What is the government's definition of affordable housing when they're using it in this context? Although affordable housing is mentioned in the bill, it's not defined. And again, we will hear in relation to that, oh, it's because the definition shifts and changes over time and context. Sure. And that's the problem, right? We know the definition shifts and changed. So therefore, it gives you a lot of leeway if you stop talking about public and social housing and you start talking about affordable housing. It gives you a hell of a lot of leeway in terms of where you can go with that. Just as an example, Mr. President, in various discussions on this bill and in briefings, we had raised some conversation around hunting field developments. There's a hunting field development, a large one, which we've considered in this place because it came through the housing supply land order process, somewhat controversially, I felt, as per my disallowance, attempted disallowance. But there was a previous small parcel in Huntingfield prior to that was released. And there was an intention that I think, from memory, 40-odd blocks, something like that, going to be affordable housing. There were going to be affordable housing offered on those. Do you know how many of those resulted in being affordable housing? Zero. So it's all very well to have intentions, to have statements, to use the word affordable housing, but it gives you a hell of a lot of leeway. And much as we continue to hear about the other massive development that's going into Huntingfield, the intention that 10 to 15% is going to be social and affordable housing. Oh, there we go, Mr. President.
Affordable to who? That's
to
the
who?
Question. Yeah, that's the question.
To who? Absolutely. And how much of that will be preserved genuinely for what we would think of as the purpose for social housing and the cohorts that need it? It's yet to be seen. That fast track we did on that development, the fast track in 2019, was it, Mr. President? 2019? Yeah, I think it was September 2019 when we fast tracked that. Any buildings there? No.
Some of us did.
Yeah. And some would say, look, that's a reason for this, right? We need to get things out of the ground fast. We need to could happen faster. Who knows? Maybe it could have happened faster if this had been in place. Case hasn't been made, Mr. President. Case hasn't been made. And as I said, plenty to point to with what's happening right now and the need for improvement. Plenty. But it doesn't mean this is our only option going forward. So I'd like to understand the government's current definition and understanding of affordable housing. When it's using the term right now, it uses it in the bill, it uses it in the second reading speech. Sure, caveat being it may change, but right now, what is it? And I am left wondering, Mr President, what the status of public and social housing will become if this new model comes to pass. I do wonder about the extent to which public and social housing will maintain prominence as a priority for Homes Tasmania as iterated in this bill. It's not clear enough to me, actually, what that trajectory is, and I don't think there's been enough reassurance given in any of the commentary on this bill. It certainly concerns me that we may be on a trajectory with this bill where more and more state assets, public and social housing, are sold off or given to private ownership or possibly turned over to other purposes. We know it can be really problematic. It can really get up people's noses, Mr President, if public land is given for a particular purpose to an institution and then the institution may decide to change the purpose of that down the track. Now, that's something that we know the community can get fussed about. Now, if public assets, public and social housing assets are to become diminished, decreased, used for other purposes, given away, that's something that I think is less influenceable and accountable under this model. And I do note that that appears to be a concern that was shared by a number of stakeholders in submissions on the bill. We know that there were various recommendations made in those submissions about a power to safeguard public assets and ensure they may remain used for public good and relieving housing stress in our community. And I think perhaps the government would like to say something more on the record about how they have addressed those concerns raised and what they can point to provide more reassurance about that, so we have that on the record. Others here have talked about the financial side of this bill and the entity that it puts in place. Others who are better equipped to do it than I, Mr President. My understanding is that this is virtually the only area that's different, really, when it comes to the model in this bill compared to what's possible now. Not what is now, because we know it's not operating necessarily as well as it could and doing all the things we'd like. But in terms of model versus model, what we've got now and its potential compared to what we're proposed under this bill, only real difference seems to be that it can leverage borrowings on the asset base. I still don't really understand why we can't do that to some extent now. I also wonder what's the expectation then in regards to any borrowings that Homes Tasmania may do. We have certainly been very familiar in this state, Mr President, with being saddled by housing debt, until very recently, in fact. We know exactly what impact it has when we have to devote significant amounts of funding to loan repayments instead of using it to provide homes and services. I'm concerned. Will we end up in a situation where Homes Tasmania, if it comes to pass, will be using properties that are now government and public social housing assets and potentially racking up debts and also potentially then having to use those assets or elements of those assets commercially to maximise rental income to service debts. And then we see public assets being used in that way rather than the core purpose of providing housing and services to people in need. Mr President, the second reading speech does indicate a new area of focus for the Housing Tasmania Authority. It says this. Well, actually, I shouldn't have said that. It does indicate an area of focus for the Housing Tasmania Authority, not a new one. This legislation creates a role for Homes Tasmania in broader housing considerations beyond what the current department has historically held. This means it can consider our community housing needs and how our vulnerable are supported within this. It also means it can play a role in key worker accommodation and how that fits within the broader housing need, particularly in regional areas or areas of high demand. And it's interesting that it says that and it describes it as being beyond what the current department has historically held, because actually that element of the bill is carried forward from the Homes Act that we currently have, I believe. I think it's 15A in the Homes Act that we have now, which has been carried over into this bill in section 47. We have the ability to look at things like key worker accommodation. We've got the ability to look at for, I think, as it's stated in there, statutory entities, local governments, that sort of thing, and industry, it says. So I'm interested why this has been framed up as something new when on my reading it looks like it's something that is already in existence. I'm not aware that it's been used recently. I'd like to know whether it's been used in the current Act. I also wonder whether this is something that the Tasmanian community would expect our state government to be doing and investing in and providing. When you think about it competing with the need that we have also to be providing for our public and social housing sector and actually providing our citizens and those most in need with homes. We know we've got shockingly high waiting list going up and up. We know that the wait is very, very long. Nearly 5 years. How can we possibly see it as appropriate to use our very limited resources and effort to subsidise housing for an industry instead of providing it to our needy citizens? I'd like to know a bit more about what the expectation is. The government says this is a new area. It doesn't seem like a new area to me. It looks like it's capable already under the Homes Act, but even so, it's in this bill. If it comes to pass, what's the plan? How's that going to be balanced? How are those various potential activities going to be balanced against each other? How will we decide whether providing funding or assistance to build a suite of houses for a particular corporate entity or industry interest weighs against perhaps a couple of suburbs over or scattered through a town nearby providing homes for Tasmanians currently homeless? I'd be interested to hear about that. Mr. President, I'll flag here I do have some amendments principally that relate to the purposes of the Act section and the principles in the Act. I'm still tweaking some of those. There'll be a new version of them coming to members at some stage before the committee stage. They're minor things that we'll deal with when we discuss it during committee stage. I'm hopeful that people will see them as valuable adjustments. They're not policy changes. They're not particularly dramatic in the impact that they have, but I think they're just some important tweaks that I'd like people to consider. One of the things I'll pick up on that we will look at in one of those amendments, but the proposed amendment came about because of a question that was raised in my mind when I was considering this bill, and that was under this model proposed in the bill with the statutory authority, the Homes Tasmania, who holds responsibility for reducing the numbers of Tasmanians experiencing housing stress and homelessness? Where does that responsibility sit, Mr. President, under the model? Of course it should sit with Government of the Day, the Executive Government, with the Minister for Housing, primarily. We can all play our part. Of course, all of us can play our part into that space. But when we talk about fundamental policy responsibility, where does it sit? And I think the creation of this authority, the institution of a skills-based board for it who are responsible for that strategy and governance and putting these plans in place does provide a lack of clarity. Then there is a blurring of a line. There is a gap between the minister and that board, and I fear that into that gap, down that chasm, might fall the sense of fundamentally who's responsible and who we hold responsible. Certainly concern was expressed in many submissions on the draft bill that under this model social housing and specialist homelessness services would be less seen as essential services. And I think that that's a key concern too, a balance of things. A balance of objectives and principles is needed for sure. I'm concerned that that's not adequately expressed or confirmed. And it is, and I think the member for Elwick raised this as a concern also in his contribution, I do worry about the balance between providing a priority to social housing and public housing and Against that, the greater opportunity provided in this bill for corporate welfare, which may then become prioritised, particularly if it is ultimately more lucrative and can be then justified as feeding back into repaying debts that we accrued through the model. I also do wonder, Mr. President, where Homes Tasmania in this model connects into the private rental market, including, for example, intersecting with responsibility for policy in that area and reform of, say, the Residential Tenancy Act. We know these two things intersect and that there will naturally be crossover because some of the activities that are the responsibility allocated to Homes Tasmania in the bill work into that market. I'd like to be clearer about where that intersection, what that intersection looks like. We've now inserted, I think, into section 49.2, I think it's in this Act, and this is new compared to the existing Homes Act. We now say subject to the Rental Tenancy Act 1997, etc., and it talks about tenants in public and social housing being covered by that Act. I'd like that confirmed, that all public and social housing tenants are covered by the Residential Tenancy Act under what's proposed in this bill. And I'd like, I guess, alongside that too, to understand, does anything in the bill jeopardise or diminish the tenure of public and social housing tenants from what we see in the current arrangements? That's a clear thing I'd quite like an answer to. Mr. President, the second reading speech says, a key feature of the bill is the strategic focus on building communities so that our housing developments are planned and coordinated with our communities as they grow and change. Now, that's interesting because I thought that was an area that's covered by our planning system. It's also an area covered by our local governments, and it's also an area covered by things like our regional land use strategies, currently being reviewed apparently sometime soon, coming to a government review near you. There's plenty going on in the planning system. We know that, Mr. President. We've got a planning reform agenda. We've got TAS planning policies. We've got updating the regional land use strategies. We've got review of state planning provisions. All of that's happening. None of that relates to this directly. We don't need this for those things to continue. And in fact, what's established under this bill, Homes Tasmania, will have to intersect with those as per the arrangements in our planning system. And so I'm not sure really to what extent it's different to now. I'm just not clear on that. I don't think we need Homes Tasmania in order to be working with our planning system and with the other entities and stakeholders in that system to try and get better outcomes. I've heard the Minister asserting that the new model will be able to be involved in urban renewal, and certainly what jumps straight to mind is that we currently have many stakeholders involved in our social housing sector already involved in urban renewal through the planning of their housing projects and the delivery of a range of services that sit in and around the housing that they build and manage and own in all kinds of communities around the state. Urban renewal is something that's already underway. It happens under the current model. Could we improve it? Sure. Absolutely. We could talk about many ways, no doubt. We could learn many lessons from what's being done effectively now. We don't need a new model for that. I'm pleased to hear that if this new model does come to pass, it's going to get involved, sure. But that's not a central pillar of what... it's not necessary to establish this authority in order to deliver that. I'm interested in the structure of the entity and staffing, what will look different compared to now. Staffing-wise, do we have some information about anticipated staffing of Homes Tasmania should it come to pass? I'm also interested in I guess, some comments from the government around that issue of funding through to service providers in the housing and homelessness space. In its submission on the draft bill, Anglicare said this, the Housing Authority be given necessary powers to support a responsibility for providing safe, adequate and appropriate supported accommodation to meet the needs of vulnerable Tasmanians, including ensuring adequate recurrent funding for services and staffing. You can't just build things, Mr President, put people in them and then not adequately and securely over a long term provide funding to deliver a level of service that's required. Clearly the sector are looking for reassurance that this new model, should it come to pass, will more effectively and confidently do that than we've seen previously. Others have talked about reporting. We know that there is a range of reporting. I presume we'll still get the same data through quarterly dashboards and things like that. The thing that does concern me is that while, yes, we will still have annual reports, we will still have estimates, processes, I am concerned. I did ask in the briefing, will we still be able to ask questions in Parliament to get answers? Because that's a really key, ongoing and more immediate way to be holding government to account and holding the functions of government to account. And I share the member for Elwick's concern here that while we were reassured that, yes, we can still ask questions of the Minister about matters to do with this entity once it's there, I share the concern that we may not then actually receive any answers or any information. And I also noted that answer provided in the other place.
When I said October too, I meant October next year,
yes,
not
did.
this one.
No, when they do their annual report
on the financial
for 22-23.
Yeah.
That's
ridiculous
right.
answer.
Utterly unacceptable. It's the same minister with a different portfolio responsibility talking about the same model that we're proposing here in a separate statutory entity, that we've been told we could seek information directly from the minister through questions in Parliament as per usual practice. And yet we've just had that same minister in that same context but a different portfolio area bat that question away, bat it away to 13 months away, 13 months from now. Come back and ask me in 13 months, I'll tell you then. Not good enough from a minister. Absolutely. And if that's the reassurance we've got about accountability through the minister, through questions in Parliament, for this, utterly unacceptable. Perhaps the minister would like to give us some reassurances about that. I do note that there is an expectation that there will be advisory committees set up to the proposed board of this Homes Tasmania entity. And I think that that's positive, of course. Consultation and advisory groups is one form of consultation. It shouldn't be a box we tick to say, yep, we've done consultation, we've got an advisory group. Of course, there'd be an expectation that consultation would go beyond simply an advisory group. Remains to be seen. But we also have a ministerial reference group on housing and homelessness. The minister has told us that it met this year in July and has been working to help develop the 20-year housing strategy. So will that reference group continue to the minister, and then what relationship would the ministerial reference group have to the advisory committees to the board of Homes Tasmania, I wonder? The other missing piece, I think, because I haven't heard it said specifically in relation to these advisory committees to the board, is where is lived experience? So where are the voices of lived experience in terms of consultation and advisory groups? They need to be there, not just in people who are receiving services through the entity of Homes Tasmania and those that it funds, but also potential members of the community who would potentially receive service, who are waiting for service or who may need service. That would be also a lived experience group to be interacting with. So I'm interested to hear about where that may be present in the model. And one final thing about the model that I also wondered, and again, this is probably prompted, Mr President, by the current context, the quite sad and disturbing current context that we found ourselves in terms of the commissioning inquiry. So some of the services that are included in this area covered by the bill are shelters and support services for children and young people. And that's delivered through often funded services, and I presume that would be the same under the bill. And I guess that should prompt us to ask ourselves who's responsible for child-safe practices within this model, who is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the safety of Tasmanian children involved in this service system should this model come to pass. Does that come back to the Board of Homes Tasmania as the funder of those services? Does it come back to the Minister as the portfolio responsibility for the area that's operating in? So where would we find ourselves, God forbid, Mr President, if in a commission of inquiry down the track we were looking at services funded through this entity, delivered in the community to children and young people, and we wanted to track back responsibility for child safety and child safe practices? If the government could provide an answer to that, I'd be much appreciated. Mr President, in the second reading speech, the government asserts that no one in this House can deny that we don't need to do things differently. And it says also this in the speech: I want to make it clear that this government is committed to pulling all possible levers to addressing our housing challenges. Now, I agree with that first statement. We absolutely all do agree we need to do things differently. It doesn't mean we all agree that this is the right different that needs to be done. And in terms of that second one, committed to pulling all possible levers to address our housing challenge, I can't let that pass, Mr President, as a statement made by this government. Many in this place, in the other place and in the community have been pointing out the many, many things this government could be doing differently for years now, all to no avail, to a government that is determined to ignore evidence-based advice that doesn't fit with its ideological agendas, all the while allowing obscene escalations of our state's housing emergency. To read in the second reading speech the government's claim that they will leave no stone unturned in delivering homes and housing support services Tasmanians deserve is quite frankly nauseating, Mr President. After 8 years of failing to deliver on announcements and promises, after refusing to consider sensible reform and regulation to alleviate market failure in our private rental system in this state, at best, comments like that are delusional. But at worst, I fear that there's gaslighting. Yet again, here's some things that the government isn't doing differently. Here's some levers it still refuses to pull. Reform of the Residential Tenancy Act. Reform of that Act could immediately then deliver us sensible rent controls. Sensible rent controls, not market equivalents. A sensible decision about what's a reasonable amount a rent could rise and should rise in any given year. That's not a race to the top, that's just sensible regulation. Removal of no grounds eviction, so people can't just be kicked out at the end of a tenancy in order to deliver a rent rise and get new tenants in. Other jurisdictions have gone down this path. There's very clear ways you can protect landlords and make sure that there are still very clear pathways available to eviction when it's needed. But no grounds eviction has no place in a contemporary rental, private market rental. No place at all. Pets and minor modifications, we're way behind on that, Mr President. This is a fundamental barrier for some people in our private rental sector, something we could address through reforming this Act. Protections, better protections in the Act against discrimination for single-parent families and welfare recipients. These are just a range of things that should and could be discussed were we to reform our Residential Tenancy Act and put conditions in place that better protected those in our rental market, particularly the ones around rent are the thing, because that's driving homelessness at the moment, rental increases. We've neglected to do it for years. 4 years. Another one, another lever, refusing to pull, refusing to do it, even though the calls are there, the evidence-based calls are there, regulating the short-stay accommodation market, empowering local government properly to set locally appropriate limits and regulation for whole houses being shifted into the short-stay market. Another identified key driver of problems in our private rental market. Absolutely failing to respond to that. How dare this government say that it's prepared to pull all levers when it's a blatant lie? They blatantly are refusing to pull many levers. So, Mr. President, here's what I'd encourage members to think about. Yes, we have some challenges and need for change. The right way forward would have been to clearly identify, quantify, analyse and consult on the challenge, design possible solutions tailored to those issues, consult further on the possible solutions and take forward a well-understood, co-designed plan, which may well have involved a new model. Importantly, a process like that would also have provided a framework within which to identify and fully discuss other potential impacts and risks possible in the possible ways forward. That is not what we've seen with this model. That is not what we've seen. It seems clear that all the things that this model can do are basically able to be done now, setting aside leveraging the asset base, although it's not clear to me that we can't do that now. In many cases, the things in this model are being done now, perhaps not to the extent that's wanted. It's not to say we can't improve what's being done now, but the possibility is there. So the question is, why do we need to change the model, which should be able to deliver the outcomes we want? I think, to sum up, Mr. President, it would be fair to say I'm highly concerned by this bill and the new model that it seeks to establish. With my background in the community services sector and the last decade of that working in policy research and advocacy in, among other areas, particularly housing and homelessness policy, public policy, I recognise the magnitude and urgency of the problems that we face here. No one can suggest that I don't. I very much want to see improvements going forward. I very much want to see us able to house particularly our most vulnerable Tasmanians. I'm very aware that we have failed to progress enough across the last decade in what state government has sought to do or failed to do. Overall, we've gone backwards. We need to do more, Mr. President. We need to do things differently, absolutely. I'm just yet to be convinced that this bill presents us with the best option going forward without other additional risks also. So I'm interested to hear answers to some of the things brought up by other members and some of the things I've raised. As I said, I do have amendments that I will bring on some language aspects in the bill, but I remain highly concerned at this moment.
The question is that the bill be now read the second time. Honourable Member for McIntyre.